Making up with a superpower is never easy.
It's very good to be here in China after quite a long time between visits.
Foreign Minister Penny Wong's arrival in Beijing, marking 50 years since the Whitlam government first established diplomatic relations with China.
The Australian people had more information on China in the last month than they'd had for more than 20 years.
This is an important relationship for Australia. It was in the 70s. It has been through the decades since.
Penny Wong's meeting with her Chinese counterpart, the first ministerial visit to China in 4 years.
The last several years have been extremely difficult. We've seen diplomatic communication break down to the point where we haven't had any communication at all.
China rolled out $20 billion worth of trade sanctions and stopped taking our calls after the former government introduced new foreign interference laws, banned Chinese telco Huawei from the 5G network and called for an inquiry into the origins of COVID.
We have an opportunity with the new government. We've also seen a real dialling down in terms of the rhetoric that's been used around the relationship, a much more calm and consistent approach on both sides.
On the agenda, trade sanctions, human rights abuses and the release of detained Australian broadcaster Cheng Lei and writer Yang Hengjun.
The expectation should be is that we will have a meeting and that dialogue itself is central to stabilising the relationship.
As China itself opens up after a really difficult and challenging time through COVID, China is also looking to build its international legitimacy.
The meeting's been hailed a diplomatic breakthrough. So is the ice beginning to thaw
The ice thaws, but slowly.
on one of our frostiest relationships?
Well, Badiucao is a Chinese dissident artist who fled China for Australia in 2009. He's one of the leading voices against the current regime. Badiucao, welcome. Now, the Foreign Minister, her visit to China right now is being billed as this diplomatic breakthrough. Do you agree with that?
Well, I heard a lot of people saying, this is the way that we break the ice. But I feel like it's actually good to keep the ice so that we can walk safely to the path, leading us to prosperity instead of problem. Because we don't know what's beneath the ice. What I can see from China is a lot of human rights crisis. It's a deep threat to our national security. So maybe break the ice is not a good idea.
But that adversarial relationship that we've had with China in recent years hasn't really changed what China's doing on human rights or changed the security picture in the region. And it certainly hasn't seen the release of people like Yang Hengjun or Cheng Lei. Do you see why there are some that think, actually, you've got to at least talk with the Chinese government if you're going to get progress on some of these issues?
I do agree, to some extent that we need to continue the dialogue. That's important. However, it's also very important we understand that the Chinese regime, the CCP, is such against the regime, a dictatorship. So when you are trying to negotiating with such an entity, that it's very important that you don't compromise your integrity.
Yeah.
I know before
Do you think we're doing that, though, by Penny Wong going there?
Well, let me tell you this incident. Actually, I met Penny Wong several years ago in 2019. I was lobbying with the Hong Kong activists during the protest time. She met us. She actually met me in person. But she's in the opposition or shadow foreign minister. But this time, I think just several weeks ago, she's refusing to meeting the Uyghur survivors from the concentration camp in China. So I wonder what makes this difference. And it's quite problematic for me.
How do you think we should be managing the relationship with China? What should the government be doing?
I think if there is a red line, say, any democracy or free country should dealing with an oppressive regime, it's very important that, a genocide, an ongoing genocide is the red line that countries should not cross. And once it crossed, then our reaction, our relationship, diplomatic relationship had to be fundamentally changed. We can't just go back easily to the old part saying everything is fine. Let's still doing the business. Let's not talking about the human rights issues. Once that red line has crossed, like China did, then we must react. But unfortunately, I'm seeing Australia is deviated from China for a period of time, but now every sign is showing it's going back.
Well, let's talk a little bit about your artwork that you do, because often it's quite humorous, but you use it to make, I guess, quite strident political points. How do you view the role of art in, I guess, affecting change in places like China?
I think it's extremely important because in order to telling the story that far away from China, that we have to find a language that, overcome the difference, the culture difference. And visual language sometimes is a very efficient but also playful language. Also, the other thing for the authoritarian regime, they're always very serious. They're pretending they're righteous, you know. They can't take humor, they can't take political satire. That's where the cartoonist or critical art can play in a role to really diminish their authority.
There was a moment in recent months when Xi Jinping became president again for another term, some say for life, effectively. And it looked like he was at the peak of his power. But now COVID is sort of unleashing in China, it seems.
Yeah.
Probably in the way that much of the rest of the world's already experienced in recent years. And suddenly it looks maybe not as strong. Do you view him at this moment as strong or weak?
Well, he's definitely facing the challenge. That's what we see and we hear from the people in the street in China. They're chanting, you know, CCP stepping down, Xi Jinping stepping down. It's definitely showing, you know, all this censorship propaganda within China is failing. That the people are not as brainwashed as we imagine. But the very visits like Penny Wong to China, it's basically crowning Xi Jinping with his power again, right after he changed the constitution and become this lifelong president. So this is not really good.
We're propping him up, is what you're saying.
Exactly. This is a, well, credit or compliment to his change and abuse to China's rule of law, to democracy.
Badiucao, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
And for your perspective.